welcome to Convocation. And today we have Brendan McCarthy, who received his PhD in ancient history from The Ohio State University. You have to remember the. He studied social networks, rumors, and gossip in the Roman Republic. And while he was a graduate student, he also helped revamp the way that graduate students teach online courses. He currently teaches ancient history at Utah Valley University, UVU, just up the road an hour or so. And his current research includes injuries in Roman battle, as well as social capital in Roman elections. And today he'll be talking about elections in ancient Rome. So let's give a round of applause to our presenter, Brendan McCarthy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you very much for coming. Today I'm going to give a speech, I guess, about winning an election in ancient Rome. And I think we can learn a lot about the way Romans kind of understood social interactions, the way Romans competed against each other for favor, and maybe we'll learn something about ourselves along the way. And yeah, please feel free to ask me any questions at the end, whether it's about this talk or perhaps you're one of those TikTokers who thinks about the ancient Romans quite a bit. I'm always happy to talk about ancient Rome, as you can imagine. All right, so the first thing, oftentimes when we think of ancient Rome, we think of the emperor in a gladiator box, vying for favor, or the general on the battlefield. But today we're going to focus on a period of Roman history before all that happened, a period called the Roman Republic, when Rome was governed by officials that were elected by public votes for one-year terms. You can imagine that's quite a lot of action, having to constantly re-elect officials every 1 year. The Romans voted in voting blocks, and they voted both to elect officials and to enact legislation. You could also add a third type, which is voting for criminal trials, but those are a smaller group of voters usually. And they had different types of voting blocks for different purposes. And this is a little bit important because when we talk about the way Romans campaign for office, they have to be very mindful of what exactly they're kind of targeting. The same way that it works very similar to the Electoral College today, where we don't all vote as individuals for the President of the United States. Instead, our vote is tallied together, and then our states vote as a unit based on how we vote. That's very similar to the Roman system, where they have a unit that votes based on how the people of that unit vote. So what I'm really going to focus on today is kind of comparing and contrasting a text called the Commentariolum Petitionis. Bit of a mouthful. It means the little commentary, the itty-bitty commentary on petitioning, right? So the pamphlet on campaigning for office. And this was written in 64 BCE, and it has this historical moment of discussing one man's attempt to become consul, the chief office of Rome. And one way to think of the consul is there's two consuls, and they're basically both mayor at the same time. So they have to try to get along with each other, and they're trying to tell the Senate what to do each time. The Senate is kind of the one branch of Roman government that's always around. But what the Commentariolum tries to do is present a type of running for office that solves a lot of problems Romans are seeing at the time. So the big issue is responding to bribery. Romans have become very concerned that there's too much money in politics. Stop me if that sounds familiar. And they want to create, or rather renew, the norms about running for office on your own strengths, not by taking out big loans and using a lot of money. So it's an idealized form of campaigning. It shows an ideal campaign, not necessarily a real campaign. And I think if we compare this kind of idealized version of running for office with what's really happening in ancient Rome, we can learn a lot about the way Rome was changing at the time and the way they fail to account for those changes. And that's what this speech is really going to be about, is kind of responding to changes. And, thinking about the way we vote in the United States has become a major political issue today, and it's worth looking at how other peoples have dealt with similar issues as the culture around them changed. All right, so let's talk about how Romans, the Commentariolum presents this process. And the biggest piece of advice is networking. You get your squad around you. So this will begin a very Taylor Swift heavy portion of the speech. So just be prepared for that. But what Rome was encouraged to do was gather all of their friends around. And the Roman word for friends, amici, is used for basically anybody whose name you know. So they were encouraged to, this was the one time in their life, they were meant to interact with just anybody they possibly knew, whether they were your social equal, your social better, your social inferior, your family members, in-laws, your slaves, your freedmen, which were the former slaves that you freed, anybody you knew. This particularly is written for a man whose career was focused on defending people in court. So he's going to call in all the favors for the people he's defended over his career and just get as many people around them as possible. And I want to focus on this last line here because the goal is to have all these people form your public reputation. And that brings us to the real reason why this is a Taylor Swift theme. The reputation is the most important aspect of this campaign. If you think of a modern campaign, a lot of times we focus on policy. What are we going to do about the border? How are we going to help the economy? And sometimes those policies are pretty half-baked, right? We're going to fix the border. We're going to fix the economy. Well, in Rome, the goal was to be well-known. That's pretty much the big issue here, is just to get people talking about you and become famous. And ideally, they're saying good things about you. And that's why it's important to have a career where you can curry favor with people and you call in those favors. So they'll say, he was nice to me, he was a really strong support when I was in court, he helps me, he's a good boss. And it's phrases like that that are the goal, not necessarily phrases about your political achievements, your ability to enact policy. It's about your behavior and your social relationships. And I think, when we circle back around at the end, this is actually going to be a really important insight into how Romans think about their government in the first place. This isn't just kind of meaningless handshaking and becoming buddies. This is a real value that Romans needed in their government. So with reputation, this is from a different source, but it's from the same time period. And this is advice to a man who is defending somebody in a trial, and it's the prosecution in a trial. And it's all about how you need to look at their lifestyle and comment on their lifestyle and use their reputation to your advantage, whether you're on the defense or on the prosecution in court, whether we're talking about the defendant himself or his legal counsel, as we would call it today, his advocates. And we see this also in the way Romans ran. Most politicians gave a speech at the start of their campaign. It's called their in toga candida speech, in their candidate's toga. Candida actually means white. It means rubbing lime into your toga to make it look white. And you can see it in all sorts of medical conditions where your tongue is white or your skin is blanched. But it also is where our word candidate comes from. And the one speech we have in toga candida actually only exists in quotations. And it's all about how terrible the other competition are. Stop me if that sounds familiar, right? The mudslinging in politics comes from long before our own time. But using reputation, both to your advantage and to your opponent's disadvantage, is a very important aspect of Roman elections. Your network needs to target specific parts of the city. You're not just casting a wide net hoping you catch all the fish. Instead, you need to target certain demographics. You need to get out the vote. And this is why it's important to understand how Romans voted. They vote by different blocks that are defined by their tribes. And a tribe was your kind of geographic region. We get the word, our modern use of the word tribe is quite different from the original Latin word. And even the way the Romans use it at this time is different, because it's, not that that's important, but the candidate needs to target specific tribes. There are 35 tribes, and the voting blocks are divided in part by tribe. They're also divided by wealth. So ideally, you look at the wealthiest men of Rome from all the different tribes, and that's where you focus your effort. But remember, reputation is the key, and they want to be able to support a candidate who shows their entire tribe generosity and shows their entire tribe that they're a nice guy. So you have to target wide groups of people in a variety of tribes. You have to be very mindful about the way you focus your network and the actions you undertake. And a lot of times this would take the form of holding a feast for tribe members or inviting them to a major festival you were funding to make sure that different people in different tribes all got to experience your generosity. All right, so those are the three key steps advocated in this document. You squad up, your squad supports your reputation, and you spread that reputation mindfully to all the different tribes in the city. And those are all things that politicians do. But they're not the only things politicians do. And as a matter of fact, we see much more aggressive political styles. So the first major change in politics is how much money elections cost in this period. And Roman politicians start having this major debt crisis because they are going into debt to fund extravagant public shows that demonstrate their generosity to huge groups of people. There are something like 100 days of religious festivals that usually have things like chariot races, gladiator fights occasionally, comedic performances, and free meals. When we think about religious sacrifice in ancient Rome, this isn't like, you're doing something for your neighbor. This means killing an animal to give to the gods. But the gods only eat the bad part of the animal, and the rest of the animal is just one big barbecue. So you're funding a giant barbecue for the community when you're hosting these festivals. So again, this is major forms of generosity. It costs a lot of money to fund these major performances, and you don't want to be the person who hosted a really lame religious observance. First off, the gods get mad. Second off, people are going to think you're stingy, and they're not going to spread a positive reputation of you. So you need to spend a lot of money. And we have great examples of this from Julius Caesar. who held an office called the Aedile early in his career, 2 years before he ran for consul. And the idea is, as Aedile, you have to fund big public performances. And Caesar funded restorations of temples, restorations of public spaces, and he also did a special performance in honor of his dad. He hosted a gladiator fight with 300 pairs of gladiators supposedly wearing silver armor. You can imagine it would be like hard to look at unless it was cloudy. But that was the goal, is to make a really dazzling, literally dazzling display of kind of generosity, piety. It shows piety to his father, and who doesn't, a man who respects his dad, right? Those Kelsey family values, those are very important in a lot of our values today, right? And they're important to Rome as well. And that was one thing Caesar was doing, was getting around this law that banned the performances of gladiators in religious festivals. They were only meant to be a funeral observance. So Caesar put off his dad's funeral for like a year and a half so that he could celebrate it while he was in office. The other big issue happening in Rome is that it's a big international empire. It's an international, multi-ethnic empire that is still run by what's basically a civic government. So it's like having a mayor running this multi-ethnic empire. And the different peoples neighboring Rome, interacting with Rome, conquered by Rome, are constantly trying to get special considerations from the Roman government. So foreign influence is a major issue in Rome. Why are all the Romans friends with these Egyptian kings, right? And that was a major issue that's happening at around this time in history, the 60s, is the Egyptian king Ptolemy Auletes, Ptolemy the flute player, was kicked out of Egypt, and he needed an army to restore him. So he spent years bribing Roman officials, trying to influence the politics, ends up in a murder conspiracy, trying to get the Roman army to come and save Egypt. The problem is, of course, that nobody in Rome wanted their political rivals to be the guy who gets to conquer Egypt. So they stonewall anybody who tries to lead an army in Egypt. They even use, this becomes an issue of religion in politics. They dig up this book called the Sibylline Oracles, which the Romans apparently just like flip open to a random page when they have a big, intractable political dispute, and they try to find wisdom in whatever line they open to. So one of the priests demanded that they consult the Sibylline Oracles. They played a little roulette with it, and they learned that they're not supposed to interfere in foreign affairs. That didn't stop one enterprising Roman who just went against it in the first place. But this is another indication, again, that Rome, the government of Rome, isn't responding to the realities around them. So you end up with this big amount of foreign money. You end up with these huge loans that people are taking on. In addition to, or sometimes instead of, doing what they're supposed to do, which is, show up in the forum, make sure people know their name, show how many friends they have, demonstrate their generosity in humble ways. So this is major changes, and I think that this shows ways in which Romans understand the world around them is changing, but they refuse to deal with them on a big level. So they have major issues with competition, right? People are competing very strongly with each other for these positions. We don't know a ton of specific elections in Rome, but the ones we do know had about 5 people running for consul, which means there were 2 winners and 3 losers. Technically, there should be about 8 people qualified to run in their year, as the Romans called it, right when they first get the ability to. So you have 6 losers out of that, and then the next year, maybe those 6 guys are going to run again, right? So we can have an incredibly competitive spate of elections in Roman history, and a lot of these men are going to be losers. The problem is, because of the loans they're taking out, because of the promises they're making to foreign people, this becomes a zero-sum game. Losing has dire consequences. This isn't just gentlemen politicians who need to try again next year. No, this is somebody with what would nowadays be something like millions of dollars in debt. Supposedly one politician died with hundreds of millions of sesterces, which would be, sesterces is about as much money as you could expect to make in like a month of work. So we're talking about extensive amounts of money in debt. And of course, who's funding these campaigns? Well, a very small number of incredibly wealthy men are giving out these loans in the first place. So we see a lot of power coalescing around the loans. But with the Commentariolum, while it highlights these problems and proposes a solution, which is kind of a return to normal, it also ignores major changes in Roman life. The population of the city was growing. Citizenship had recently expanded to a whole group of people. All of Italy at this time had become Roman citizens just 20 years before this was written. So it ignores these major changes. How is a candidate supposed to make friends all around Italy? Well, in reality, they don't have to, because they don't vote in their cities. There's one place in the entire Roman Empire where people cast their vote. There's one day to vote. So you have to be in Rome. You have to go to a place called the Septa in order to vote. But what's happening is wealthy people around Italy have their second homes in Rome, and they plan on being in the city to vote in these elections. It also overlooks the influence that Rome's conquests have had on Rome. Obviously, I've already talked about the issues that foreign leaders are influencing Roman politics, but conquest has changed Rome in a lot of ways. It's brought more people into Rome through slavery or through kind of the economic engine of having this major city. It's also changed the way most Romans make a living by increasing competition in agriculture, increasing competition in wine production, olive production, especially grains. Italian grain becomes less and less important in the peninsula, which means people need to switch how they make their money, which costs a lot of money. And they're having to sell their farms and try to make work in the city. The solutions that the Commentariolum does provide, however, all this networking, the ability to create, what it really recommends is creating a temporary network. So the skill that this document values most is being able to grow your network by whatever means you can, usually by using your own reputation to build more and more connections. And this ability to very quickly change and adapt and create connections is how the Romans view their government. This is how the government usually works. Being able to respond very quickly to changes without changing the political structure is how Romans responded to this big empire. The city and its imperial government lack a professional bureaucracy. They don't try to hire official people who keep the books, who collect taxes. Instead, they rely on government contractors and on each individual governor to use their networking to create connections with local elites, local contractors, with the contractors in Rome. So being able to develop a strong network is a very important political value. This is what the government is structured on. The problem is that network only works if the politician is able to use it. And another form of competition we see are politicians refusing to help their successors with their local connections, for example. We also see issues where they have bad connections, and that leads to wider issues in the empire. It might lead to a revolt. It might lead to an opportunistic neighboring kingdom to try to attack. So this idea of these politicians having to reform all these political networks to squad up as they are taking over their territories, their government positions, is showing its weaknesses. Now, that takes us to today. The Romans do try to solve these problems, but instead of solving on the issues that I just spoke about the way government is structured, instead they view the elections themselves as the problem. They try to ban how many people you can have around you when you're out in public. They try to ban your ability to hire. There's a type of man called a nomenclator who just hangs out around you and tells you people's names. The word means the namer. So he would just tell you the names of the people you were meeting to make sure you sounded personable. They also had laws about how much money you could spend on political and religious festivals. They had laws about when you could and couldn't host gladiator games, and many different types of laws. And what they didn't do is have laws that imposed more responsibilities for the people in local imperial government. They didn't have any solutions to the influence of foreign people in politics. They didn't have any solutions to lending and the use of loans as what becomes kind of political capital. And while it's very tempting to imagine the U.S. as kind of the modern Rome, and you read all sorts of things about how the U.S. is in decline just like Rome, or the political strife just like Rome, Rome isn't the U.S. Rome has a very different set of circumstances. I think we can all appreciate the role of networking in many forms of our lives, right? Taylor Swift's network has all sorts of connections that grant her audiences that she wouldn't otherwise have, the same way that the politicians today we see with extensive networks, and the networks that they're all provided by their political parties that give them connections to all the different states. But the government is shaped very differently. The government has a professional bureaucracy. The government has well-defined positions. The government has a lot of issues a lot of aspects that the Roman government never bothered with. And while I kind of ended with Roman reform attempts, it's important to realize that there's no need to have the same issues. There's nothing inherent about the way governments grow. There's nothing permanent about these historical cycles. And that, to me, is the real value of history, is recognizing that the past gives us insights, but it isn't the script. This is our opportunity to reflect on the way other people just like us have acted in the past, and to learn from it, not to repeat it, but to try to do things differently. All right, well, thank you very much. And as I was saying, I'm very happy to answer questions. It's Leap Day, so jump to it.
All right, so Tassi, our TA, is going to come down here. So take maybe just a minute to think about questions that you have for Dr. McCarthy.
So my chair like folded up. I'll just stand. So what originally got you into like really studying the Roman Empire and everything like that? Unless you're like one of those TikTok guys as well, but.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a bit longer than that, but yeah, thanks for the question. I always liked learning about Roman, Greek mythology, I should say, Greek mythology. I've got this whole, I don't know, pet peeve about people associating Roman and Greek mythology as like two different versions of the same thing. But I really liked Greek mythology growing up. That got me into the history. And after I was into the history, I took Latin in high school, really enjoyed Latin. Gave me a great appreciation for Roman culture and that kind of mindset. You know, learning a language can give you so much insight into the way a community thinks. Language colors so much of our mindset. And then after that, I continued knowing that I wanted to teach history at some level while I was in college, and kept disliking the American history classes and kept liking the European and especially the ancient classes. Nothing against American history, but if I wanted to read the newspaper, I would just read the newspaper. So that's how it feels to me sometimes, like, oh yeah, 1850. That was recent. But yeah, I would say it was just kind of learning more about them as I grew up, kind of becoming interested more and more about how different they are really is one of the big appeals to me.
What caused the switch in Roman history from that yearly elected official to basically the royal family?
Yeah, that's a great question. How long do we have? So what ends up happening is, there are a ton of different, every historian has a different answer. This is like the third rail in, Roman history. And my take is that what ends up happening in Rome is the government is ineffective at actually governing this state. And the foreign territories are so large that they can't rely on this group of people who are creating temporary year-long relationships with local officials and contractors. It can't rely on this group of old men called the Senate. The Senate literally comes from the word for old man. And they can't rely on the Senate to just appoint their buddies to these positions. And what happens over time is politicians use more and more aggressive techniques to go around the Senate to get these positions, to lead the army on specific campaigns. And because the people can enact legislation, they can just have a public vote. But they can take a lot of energy and have a public vote on who should be able to lead the army against Mithridates along the Baltic Sea, or against Gaul, or against the Parthian Persian Empire. And the people are taking a more active interest in this because they're sick of their sons, brothers, cousins, having to fight in these protracted wars with what's essentially amateur generals. These Roman politicians, they are elected for a year in office, and then they're expected to lead the army somewhere and to govern a province somewhere. And they're trained more for talking nice than they are in leading the military. They all do have military careers. They are expected to be officers in the military before holding political office. But we know, for example, there's a man, Quintus Cicero, who wrote a letter to his much more famous brother, Marcus, talking about how, oh, I'm in Caesar's army and Gaul is the worst and it's raining all the time, but hey, I'm having a great time writing plays. So this guy is a major official, a high-ranking officer in Caesar's army. He ends up leading one of Caesar's camps, so an entire legion of people under him. And he's spending his time writing literature instead of, making sure his camp is well supplied, making sure his soldiers are drilled. The people doing that work are the next rung down, right? They're the actual professional soldiers. These politicians have kind of a half-hearted take on that responsibility. So the people keep electing and appointing talented generals for more and more important military missions and more missions in their career, which ends up creating, kind of separating the military portion of their responsibility from the more political portion. And after about 80 years of civil war, we end up with one of those generals, a guy named Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, as the one left standing. And he ends up instituting what's essentially a military coup against the Roman government and creating a monarchy. So yeah, it took a lot longer to explain that to my students last week, but there's your 5-minute overview. We had a hand up here, I thought.
Have you ever studied anything else besides the Roman politics?
Yeah, so when you get a PhD in history, you focus on a few different fields of study when you're first beginning. So I study Rome, but as part of Rome, I also studied Greece. So I could tell you all about Greece as well. Not the movie / musical, but the country. And I can also, I also took fields in early Christianity, so Christianity up until about 600 or so. Once the Germans all converted, that's kind of when my interest wanes. And then medieval Europe. So early in my graduate career, that's what I focused on. And now that I have a job, I get to focus a little bit more narrowly on my research interests, which is politics in the Roman Republic. So once it becomes a monarchy, again, I kind of lose interest. I like all the infighting and competition and all that stuff.
So I'm going to ask a question just because I'm really interested in this. So I know you don't like American history that much, and I know you don't want to make these big judgments, but we're talking about elections that look and sound, at least from where I'm sitting, a lot like elections today, but also like elections 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Is there, I guess the question is twofold. Are there big takeaways you think that we can get as regular people that might not get a PhD in ancient history?
Yeah.
And then, what are the takeaways overall? And, it's not the U.S., but at the same time, right, all of the politicians are asking for Taylor Swift to support them. You put this up there, but that it has a lot to do, at least it looks like you're attempting to imply that, at least. So maybe, I don't know if that's clear, but.
Yeah, I think, so when you look at the way American elections are structured, this idea of voting in a block, the idea of having these officials, obviously there's a lot of self-conscious emulation of the Roman system. Part of our government is called the Senate, right? And when I look at the comparisons, my takeaway is it's easy to focus on the elections themselves as a problem. And I think we see that a lot today. A lot of states are looking at ways of reforming voting, for example. We have disputes about the Federal Voting Rights Act fairly recently in the Supreme Court. And it's become something of a, it's been very politicized recently. And one of the issues I see with that is whether that's becoming, it's overlooking perhaps a more significant issue. America's changed a lot in the 250 odd years since the Declaration of Independence was written. The idea of having 50 independent countries that have a federal government that just kind of helps them along for, you know, interstate disputes and things like that is not necessarily how most of us think about the government anymore, even though that might be how it is thought of. We don't talk about the presidential election, for example, as Utah voted this way and Nebraska voted this way. Well, Nebraska's a bad example, but because they split their vote. But but that's how it's meant to be, right? It's meant to be the states themselves are voting for the president, and each state can do all sorts of things, have all sorts of options. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that the public vote defines how the state votes. So this concept of the government needs to be part of the investigation, not just trying to solve the way people vote, but thinking about the entire structure. You know, Roman government, the structure did change. It had to change. There were a lot of compelling reasons for it to change. 20 years after the Commentary Olum was written, you have Julius Caesar assassinated, and Romans think that they're going to have their government back. Julius Caesar had been a dictator, which is an official Roman position. It's not necessarily the same way we use the word today as kind of a negative connotation. But they thought they were going to go back to elections. They thought they were going to have their government back. But instead, they ended up with another 15 years of generals competing against each other, fighting against each other, until one of them finally killed all the rest and ends up with a monarchy. So when I think about Roman elections, I think about, I mean, obviously there's a lot of values, and we can see a lot of similarities, and we can use that to reflect on elections today. But I also think it can be a bit of a, it shouldn't be the only thing we reflect on. It shouldn't be the end of the reflection.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
You all know who created Leap Day? Julius Caesar. Year 46 BCE. He comes back from Egypt, where he fell in love with Cleopatra, had a child with her probably, although nobody ever really said it out loud, because that would be too scandalous for a Roman to have a child with a foreign queen. And he comes back to Rome after being besieged in Alexandria for about a year, Alexandria, Egypt. And he comes back, and he has two important positions. He's dictator, which means that he can propose any law he wants. And he's the Pontifex Maximus, the chief religious official in Rome. And in Rome, the religious colleges, they call them colleges, controlled the calendar. They have a lunar calendar. They have 12 months at this time in their calendar. They used to have just 10. And they pretended that January and February just did not exist. They just had they had like 75 random days that they just didn't do anything in the middle of winter. Because, I mean, I don't blame them. And he comes back and he decides that we're going to stop all this mucking around with the calendar. These priests are also politicians, and they refuse to add on the missing days at the end of the lunar year so that their political rivals don't have 2 extra weeks to do stuff. Because in the lunar year, each month is about 29 days. So you end up with about 15 days at the end. to match it up with the solar year. So by the time Caesar decides to reform the calendar, Rome is 3 months off the calendar. They are celebrating springtime religious festivals in the middle of winter, right? In January, basically. So the year 46 is 450 days. And Caesar says, we're not doing any more of this random 15-day calendar manipulation from the priests. Instead, we are having 12 months. Most of them are going to be 20 or 30 or 31 days. One stubby month, February, because again, they hated February. They tried not to have a February to begin with. And every 4 years, we're going to stick an extra day in February to make it feel better about itself. And that's how we got the leap day. But it's fun reading stuff from 46 because imagine like a year that's 15 months long. And that's, you can think, Caesar is the reason for the season today.
All right, well, thank all of you for coming. Let's give a last round of applause for our speaker today. And if you have any other questions you wanted to ask one-on-one, I'm sure he'd be willing to talk for a minute or so here. And otherwise, have a lovely spring break, and we'll see you in 2 weeks from now.